A detention center the size of 7 football stadiums with capacity to hold 40,000 prisoners, the largest of its kind in Latin America.
Hundreds of inmates, barefoot and stripped down to white shorts, scurry into El Salvador's new mega prison, ordered to crouch down on the ground one after another.
Inside this mega prison, you'll find some of El Salvador's most dangerous gang members packed into massive cells, towers of bunk beds, and what looks like bird cages.
What does El Salvador's infamous mega prison really look like? And how does it manage to keep some of the country's most dangerous gang members locked down for 23 hours a day? Welcome to SECOT, El Salvador's Terrorism Confinement Center, a high-tech, high-capacity fortress designed not for rehabilitation, but domination. No visitors, no mattresses, no privacy, and certainly no mercy. This ain't just a prison. This is President Nayib Bukele's response to the gang violence that has plagued his country for decades. But here's the real question. Does this brutal mega prison actually work? Or is it just hiding a deeper problem? Let's take a look inside the most feared prison on earth, El Salvador's mega prison.
It looks like a sea of skin and tattoos. These images, released by El Salvador's government, shows the transfer of about 2,000 inmates.
This footage shows El Salvador's answer to gang violence. Thousands of alleged gang members stripped down to expose their tattoos in a brand new mega prison set to house 40,000 inmates.
Located on the outskirts of El Salvador, the Terrorism Confinement Center, known as SECOT, is a large, heavily fortified prison made of concrete and steel. With its walls and electrified fences, this mega prison was built with one goal in mind: security. Every inch of its design screams control, not comfort. And it's a place where containment comes first, always. Now, SECOT's story kicks off in late 22, because that's when President Nayib Bukele's government launched an ambitious plan to build what would have become the largest prison in Latin America. Incredibly, it was completed in just 7 months and officially opened in January 23. Originally, it was meant to be a low-security rehabilitation facility with partial funding from the U.S., but that idea quickly vanished. Strategically built in the remote district of Tecoluca, about 74 kilometers southeast of the capital San Salvador, the prison's isolation only adds to its inaccessibility. Fast forward to April 25, and the government announces plans to double its capacity from 40,000 to a staggering 80,000 inmates, making it clear they're not done expanding. Now, SECOT's perimeter is built like a military stronghold. The place covers 23 hectares, and it's surrounded by 2 layers of reinforced concrete walls, each 9 meters tall and 60 centimeters thick, topped with rolls of barbed wire. And between these walls would be 2 electrified fences with high voltage current, meant to stop anyone from getting in or out. The ground is covered with gravel flooring to amplify the sound of footsteps, making any unauthorized movement audible. SECOT has 19 guard towers watching over it, providing elevated vantage points for constant surveillance and ensuring that every inch of the boundary is monitored. And on top of all of this, a 2.1 kilometer outer wall and 140 hectares of government-owned land acting as a buffer zone, sealing SECOT off even further from the outside world. But the true severity of SECOT doesn't end at that perimeter. Inside, the atmosphere is just as grim and unforgiving. The prison's buildings are cold and industrial, built for function over form. This complex has 8 massive pavilions, each about the size of 6 acres. Now, each pavilion operates like a closed loop. There are no outdoor areas and no air conditioning, despite temperatures soaring to 35 degrees Celsius. Now, it's intentionally uncomfortable. The warehouse-like structures have no windows and are made of gray concrete. Above, you can see guards patrolling over sharpened metal mesh ceilings, while also preventing inmates from tampering with anything. The outer walls are reinforced to withstand attacks, and this entire place is designed to blend into its surroundings. There are no big signs, no decorative elements, just a lot of concrete in the middle of nowhere. No cell phones within a 2-kilometer radius, making communication with the outside world virtually impossible. Now, to guard this fortress, SECOT has a dedicated force of 1,000 armed personnel. This includes 600 soldiers, 250 police officers, and up to 250 riot police for emergencies. Many stay anonymous with their balaclavas, and they're stationed everywhere, inside, outside, on catwalks, in towers, rotating shifts to maintain non-stop surveillance. Every single guard undergoes extensive screening and training to handle high-security threats. This whole operation is run by Director Bellarmino Garcia, who ensures strict discipline and coordination amongst the ranks. SECOT's armory is no less serious. It's stocked with T-65 assault rifles, live ammunition, and full riot gear, with batons and shields. The exact inventory is classified, but the sheer scale of this place suggests that it's heavily supplied. This armory is tucked away in a restricted area, accessible only to a select few, and it forms part of this advanced security setup that includes surveillance tech and emergency protocols. And all of these point to one thing: the prison is always ready for the worst.
He says they have to constantly remind themselves that they're dealing with essentially the worst of the worst, and for that reason, they need to be ready for whatever risks.
Now, besides the guards, SECOT runs with a full internal staff. You can find medical teams within each pavilion, so any health issue can be handled without leaving the complex. Administrative and support staff can take care of daily logistics, maintenance, and facility operations. Staff-only areas include dining halls, break rooms, and a gym. Getting into prison would be a process, though. Everyone is searched, scanned, and checked for metal to keep contraband out. No outside organizations nor NGOs are allowed in, keeping this prison's operations entirely self-contained. Now, apart from the staff, like we said, inside SECOT is just as harsh as its outer shell. We have 8 blocks with 32 cells each, totaling 256 cells. Each one is about 7.4 by 12.3 meters and has no windows, just harsh artificial lighting that stays on for 24/7. Inmates are sleeping on these 4-tier metal bunks with no mattresses nor sheets. Each cell has 2 open toilets and 2 wash basins with 0 privacy. A plastic barrel provides drinking water, and a cement basin with a bucket is used for washing. And if they look above, they see the guards watching them all the time, and the CCTV cameras recording everything. Solitary confinement, is even rougher, with a concrete bed, a toilet, and one tiny hole in the ceiling for light. And that's pretty much it. Oh, plus inmates can be kept in there for up to 15 days. You see, everything inside one of their cells is stripped to the bare minimum. The bunks are welded in place, no bedding. The toilets have no seats, no dividers. Wash basins are simple and functional, with just 1 bucket for cleaning. The only permitted non-structural items are 2 Bibles per cell, nothing else. With plain concrete walls and non-stop lighting, there's no place for shadows or secrecy. It's relentlessly controlled, built to contain, isolate, and dominate. Now, before we get into the brutal reality of what life is actually like for the average prisoner inside SECOT, let's talk about who ends up here and what you gotta do to land a front row seat in this fortress of misery.
Evening, and tonight we take you inside one of the most dangerous countries on earth, a place where criminal gangs control entire neighborhoods.
Tonight, mass arrests in El Salvador continue. The country's president, Nayib Bukele, doubling down on what he has called a war on gangs.
In El Salvador, 2 gangs, Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, and the 18th Street Gang, also known as Barrio 18, have built a real, terrifying legacy of violence and control. Their roots go back to the 1980s, born from a chaotic migration pattern that was shaped by the country's post-Civil War instability. MS-13 gets started in Los Angeles, formed by Salvadoran refugees escaping El Salvador's brutal civil war from 1979 to 92. Now, first, it was just a loose group of heavy metal fans, nicknamed the Stoners, who banded together for protection from other Hispanic gangs. But over time, they evolved into a far more structured and dangerous criminal network. Members would adopt iconic tattoos, often Gothic lettering or devil horns inked across the face and torso, signaling loyalty and serving as a loud declaration of membership. Now, Barrio 18 goes back even further. Starting off in the 60s, East Los Angeles by Mexican immigrants who'd been shut out by other gangs, it would eventually open the ranks to Salvadorans and other Central Americans. Their tattoos were often simpler, just the number 18 or the Roman number 18, but their structure was more organized. Leaders known as palabreros kept detailed records of finances and operations, often scribbling in physical notebooks. Both gangs were exported to El Salvador in the 1990s after waves of deportations from the U.S. And once back in a country still reeling from civil war, these hardened criminals found a society broken by poverty, weak institutions, and flooded with leftover weapons. Let's say the perfect conditions for chaos. MS-13 wasted no time spreading out. They set up shop in both cities and rural areas, demanding fierce loyalty and enforcing initiations like a 13-second group meeting. Those operations would be funded through extortion and drug dealing, and they would develop their own coded language, complete with hand signs and street slang, to communicate in secret. Now, Barrio 18, which later split into two rival factions, the Sureños and the Revolucionados, took more business-like approaches. They focused on squeezing money out of markets and small businesses, sometimes collecting tens of thousands of dollars every month in places like San Miguel. They were efficient, ruthless, and deeply organized. And by the early 2000s, it was estimated that around 60,000 gang members were in control of neighborhoods across the country. And these weren't just turf wars, but full-blown occupations. Gang rules were enforced with violence, and even talking to police could get locals killed. Cities like San Salvador became a maze of invisible boundaries, where crossing one wrong line could mean instant death. But don't get it twisted, because the Salvadoran government actually tried to fight back. Starting in the early 2000s, under the conservative Arena Party, presidents like Francisco Flores and Antonio Saca launched hardline policies like mano dura and the super mano dura, words we're hearing again today. These tough-on-crime measures used militarized police and mass arrests to crush gang leadership. But you see, the strategy often backfired. Locking up your gang members just gave them more time to organize from prison, and in many cases, it made them stronger. Later on, President Mauricio Funes takes a different route. In 2012, he helped broker a truce between MS-13 and Barrio 18, offering better prison conditions in exchange for some reduced violence. For a while, it worked. Homicides dropped by half, but the peace was short-lived. By 2014, that truce collapsed. Gangs used this to regroup, and public trust in the deal eroded fast. Even in how they used violence, the gangs had different styles. MS-13 often made headlines with some gruesome displays, like dismemberment, posting videos of mutilation, sometimes breaking their own internal codes. Barrio 18, on the other hand, would use a colder, more calculated brutality, even executing members who broke rules to just maintain discipline. Regardless, both approaches would keep a country in constant fear. One of the most horrifying examples would come in 2018, when Jose Luis Perez Madrid was kidnapped by Barrio 18 in the Veracruz neighborhood of San Salvador, right on the edge of MS-13 territory. He was beaten, tortured, stabbed, and then beheaded. His death showed just how little regard these gangs had for innocent lives. Meanwhile, extortion was bleeding communities dry. In San Miguel, vendors were paying 100,000 pesos a month in protection money to Barrio 18, or face death. That in itself is a lot to handle. But then came the tipping point. In March 2022, over just 3 days, 87 Salvadorans were killed, including shoppers, bus passengers, and market workers, most of them with no gang ties at all. Both gangs would be blamed, though Barrio 18 later tried to deny involvement. That massacre finally pushed President Nayib Bukele to act. He declares a state of emergency, saying order had to be restored, no matter the cost.
Tonight, El Salvador is under state of emergency after a deadly weekend of gang violence.
Tonight, the crackdown on gangs intensifies in El Salvador as these images of mass arrests and police searching through homes and families' belongings at neighborhood checkpoints fuel concerns that human rights are being violated.
March 27, 2022, El Salvador's Legislative Assembly. At the request of President Nayib Bukele, they declared a 30-day stay of emergency in response to that bloody violence over the weekend of March 25th to 27th. known officially as the state of exception or régimen d'exception. The emergency measures suspended several constitutional rights, which included freedoms of association and assembly, the right to private communications, and access to immediate legal counsel. It also extended the legal window for holding suspects without charges from 72 hours to 15 days. Bukele said this was necessary to restore public safety, and the Legislative Assembly, dominated by his Nuevas Ideas party, quickly approved the measure, and what followed next would be a lot of arrests. Security forces, including the National Civil Police and Salvadoran Army, launched mass raids, mainly in low-income areas known for gang activity. By March 30th, authorities arrested 576 people, and within a week, that number jumped to nearly 6,000. By April 25th, at the end of the first 30-day period, the number had reached 17,000. The Assembly extended the state of emergency on April 24th, 22, and didn't stop there. By April 1st, 25, the state of exception had been renewed 37 times, effectively turning what was supposed to be a temporary emergency into a semi-permanent policy. These extensions were consistently backed by Bukele's political allies in Nuevas Ideas, GANA, PDC, and PCN, while opposition parties like Arena, FMLN, Nuestro Tiempo, and Vamos voiced concern over growing civil liberty violations. Now, as detention surged, lawmakers expanded police powers through legislative reforms. On March 30th and April 5th of 22, the Assembly passed amendments to the Criminal Code and Criminal Procedure Code. These changes allowed the imprisonment of children as young as 12, expanded mandatory pretrial detention for gang-related crimes, and criminalizing the reproduction of gang messages with sentences up to 15 years. The reforms also enabled mass trials, with up to 500 defendants tried at once, often virtually, by an anonymous judge, and based on limited evidence. By May 25th, 22, the National Civil Police had reported 34,500 arrests. By November, that number had surpassed 58,000, which included more than 1,600 minors. You can see the intensity of this crackdown clearly in events like the siege of Soyapango on December 3rd, 2022. In that operation, 10,000 soldiers surrounded the city, went door to door, and arrested hundreds. Arrests would often be guided by a government database of 76,000 identified gang members. However, human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Cristo Sal reported widespread arbitrary arrests. People were getting detained for reasons as vague as having tattoos, living in high-crime neighborhoods, or being named in anonymous tips. The crackdown pushed El Salvador's already overstretched prison system past that breaking point, because back in December 2020, prisons were already at 136% capacity, with 39,000 inmates, and by November 2022, the prison population had ballooned to about 95,000. That's more than triple the system's designed capacity of 27,000. So, as of March 4th, 2025, over 85,000 people have been detained, and the government has claimed that around 7,000 have been released due to lack of evidence. But to address this overflow in the prison system, Bukele built SECOT, and that brings us to where we are now. So how exactly is life for the thousands of inmates now locked up behind those precious walls? Well, let's see how close we can get to finding out.
What is it like to live here?
It's probably not a hotel 5-star, but they give you the 3 times the food. They give you some programs. You go to do exercise.
There's no mattresses, there's no sheets. You've got a toilet over here for them to go to the bathroom. You've got this basin here that they use to bathe themselves. And then you can see there's a barrel of water that they can drink from.
Now we know that life inside SECOT runs on a strict, repetitive schedule designed to maintain control and limit inmates' freedom. Every minute is accounted for, with the system built to enforce discipline and eliminate personal autonomy. You see, the inmates are grouped based on their alleged gang ties or criminal charges. Most are accused of being members of either MS-13 or Barrio 18, like we already talked about, while others face their own terrorism-related charges. However, the government doesn't publicly share the exact breakdowns, nor how it decides who falls into which category. You have a small number of prisoners kept in solitary confinement due to disciplinary reasons or because they're seen as high risk. The rest would live in the general prison population, and these classifications determine where the inmates are housed within the facility's 8 pavilions. prisons, each containing 32 cells, and also control who interacts with whom. But one thing is clear, movement between groups is virtually non-existent. Your daily grind would start at 5 a.m. when guards wake up everyone for a head count, the first of several throughout the day. Breakfast comes around 6 a.m. and usually includes beans, tortillas, and a small serving of rice or plantain, all brought straight to the cells. Lunch is at noon, dinner at 5 p.m., with the same basic menu each time. Occasionally, inmates get a piece of fruit or a boiled egg. Oh, there's no communal dining. Everyone eats in their cells using plastic utensils or their hands. Metal ones are banned. Food is cooked in a centralized kitchen with portions strictly controlled to prevent hoarding or misuse. Now, between meals, inmates have limited activities, mostly focused on cleaning or mandatory programs. Like from 7 to 9 a.m., they can clean their cells, scrub floors and fixtures using shared buckets and minimal supplies, while guards supervise. This isn't about hygiene. It's another layer of control and structure. From 10 to 11 a.m., they go into these rehabilitation activities, which usually involve reading from one of the 2 Bibles allowed in the cell, or listening to pre-recorded government lectures broadcast over loudspeakers. These talks would be moral and civic lessons delivered in Spanish. Inmates must sit still and pay attention. No reading materials, no writing tools, no personal items. And again, this tight control over intellectual stimulation is very much intentional. So afternoon rolls around from 1 to 3 p.m. Now this is reflection time. Inmates have to stay in their cells, remain silent and still. Some use that time to pray, meditate, or just lie quietly on their metal bunks. Talking is discouraged and monitored by cameras. Then from 3 to 4, a small number of inmates handpicked by the guards based on behavior get to join short vocational workshops in the corridor. This would involve basic repetitive tasks like folding cloth or assembling small items. They're not held daily, and only a small group participates. Everyone else stays locked in their cells. There's no recreation. Exercise is for 30 minutes a day, and no outdoor time. Because here, physical movement isn't a priority. Containment is. Evenings are subdued. After a final head count at 6 p.m., silence is enforced from 7 p.m. until lights out at 9 p.m. Inmates can whisper or quietly share stories during this time, but if their voices get too loud, guards step in fast. Lights stay on all night, forcing prisoners to adapt to sleeping in constant brightness, and those in solitary have a worse time. They're confined 24/7. No workshops, no group interaction. Meals come through a slot in a door, and the only reading material they get is that single Bible. Even in this highly restricted environment, inmates find small ways to cope. With no access to music nor instruments, some quietly would sing songs or say prayers they've memorized. Others create mental games, recalling past memories or making up stories to share during allowed conversation windows. The Bible becomes central to their routines, as many memorize verses or even debate meanings with others. Even food can feel like a small luxury. Some save a tortilla or even a piece of fruit to eat later, slowly savoring the break from monotony. But it keeps going. Inside the crowded cells, which can hold up to 80 people, you can see unspoken social hierarchies emerging based on charisma or seniority. Open displays of dominance are discouraged, but inmates do find subtle ways to bond, sharing cleaning duties or syncing up sleep schedules to minimize disruption. And with no personal belongings, small gestures like offering someone a sip of water from the shared barrel take on big emotional weight. And for those in the general population, cleaning time and rare workshop sessions provide inmates with their only chance to interact beyond their own cellmates. But they're always under strict watch. In solitary though, man, it's just the prisoner and their thoughts, and their survival depends entirely on mental strength. And honestly, this rigid routine doesn't change. Not on weekends, not on holidays. This same schedule plays out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. On rare occasions like Christmas or Easter, guards might hand out a slightly better meal, maybe a piece of chicken or some sweet bread, but that's completely up to them. There is no visitation, no phone calls, no mail. For inmates, that prison schedule is their world. But here's the wild part. This massive prison isn't just locking up Salvadoran gang members anymore. U.S. President Donald Trump has already sent his first wave of prisoners to SECOT. That's right. America's now exporting its inmates to one of the world's most notorious prisons.
It's point blank unlawful.
In early 2025, the United States, under President Donald Trump's second administration, began deporting individuals to this mega prison. That was a bilateral agreement between him and El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele. The plan took shape after a February 2025 meeting, where Bukele, who has built a global image as a tough-on-crime leader, pitched SECOT as a destination for deportees for the U.S., especially those accused of having ties to gangs like MS-13 or Tren de Aragua.
He has agreed to accept for deportation any illegal alien in the United States who is a criminal from any nationality, be they MS-13 or Tren de Aragua, and house them in his jails.
The deal aligned perfectly with Trump's campaign promises to accelerate the deportation of undocumented immigrants and suspected gang members. This all played into Bukele's own crackdowns on gangs, like we've talked about, so it was actually a win for both sides. And by March 2025, the U.S.-El Salvador agreement was official, positioning SECOT as a transnational detention facility. Jesus, how legal is this, and at what cost?
To expedite removals of the Tren de Aragua savage gangs, I will invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to target and dismantle every migrant criminal network operating on American soil.
On March 15, 2025, 238 people were deported to SECOT under the 1798 Alien Enemies Act. Now, most were Venezuelans, a small number of Salvadorans, and while they were labeled as gang members, a CBS News investigation would find that 75% of these people had no criminal record, and only 22% had been convicted of minor offenses like petty theft. Among them would be Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, a Maryland-based worker who was wrongly deported, triggering a case now under review by the U.S. Supreme Court. Others deported would include a Venezuelan hairstylist and a delivery driver, both of whom denied any gang ties, but still endured SECOT's brutal intake process, being shackled during transport, getting their heads shaved, and being forced to kneel under guard. Financially, the U.S. pays El Salvador $6 million to accept 238 deportees. It's not bad. A much cheaper alternative to domestic incarceration, which costs around $40,000 per inmate per year. Now, for El Salvador, this payment helped offset the steep cost of its prison system. SECOT alone cost them $115 million to build, and the country's overall prison expenses total around $200 million annually.
Does the U.S. even have the legal right to send someone who's been deported from its country to a foreign prison?
The United States does not have that right.
So legally, the deportations stand on shaky ground. The U.S. is using its Alien Enemies Act, arguing that Tren de Aragua operates as a Venezuelan proxy. But intel agencies have really debunked this claim. This act would also require court hearings before deportation, which were skipped. That led legal experts like ACLU's Lee Gellert to accuse the government of committing federal kidnapping. It's wild. Also, in March 2025, Judge James E. Boasberg issued an injunction to halt the deportations, but it was ignored. So the case is now heading to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, El Salvador's ongoing state of emergency, which since April 2025 has been extended 37 times, suspends key legal protections like access to lawyers and fair trials, and as a result, many deportees remain in legal limbo. And this could violate the UN Convention Against Torture, seeing the U.S. as knowingly sending people to a prison with a track record of abuse, challenging international human rights standards. And now I'm hearing they're gonna reopen Alcatraz? Damn. Plus, some reports say that 235 people have died in SECOT, with reports of torture, beatings, and medical neglect. The UN Human Rights Office, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch have all condemned the conditions, citing severe psychological harm caused by isolation and constant artificial lighting. A former detainee would talk about daily beatings, and the NGO Cristo Sal documented over 6,000 rights violations. Damn. By August 2022, 1,825 habeas corpus petitions were filed, but only 8 were granted hearings, which pointed to a near total collapse of judicial protections. And when it comes to tackling gang violence, SECOT's impact is a little debated. As of March 2025, El Salvador has imprisoned close to 90,000 adults, making it the most incarcerated country on the planet, with 1.5% of its 6.3 million people behind bars.
Questions have been raised about that severity of treatment, and it is seen certainly as harsh. But when you talk to Salvadorans, they say, yes, perhaps harsh, but totally necessary to have eradicated the gangs and to keep them out.
Now, Bukele says his crackdown has taken down MS-13 and Barrio 18, pointing out to fewer murders and high public support. But some critics aren't convinced. They say these numbers might be misleading and that the violence didn't go away, it just moved from the gangs to the government. Thousands with no gang ties have been swept up in the dragnet, and without rehabilitation or separation by gang affiliation, some warn that crime could spike again in the future. The ongoing state of emergency has prompted the UN and OAS to demand an end to the policy. However, Bukele stands firm on his strategy, framing it as a necessary trade-off.
Now, the president has admitted that these are harsh measures, but he's also said, Todd, that when the gangs ruled the streets of El Salvador, they did not take human rights into consideration.
But the real cost of this policy goes far beyond money. This high number of incarceration and the state of emergency in general has rolled back civil liberties, and residents near Tecoluca, where the prison was built, have reported land seizures with no compensation. Internationally, El Salvador is being labeled a human rights violator, with critics calling SECOT a black hole. So for the US, that kind of partnership comes with its own serious risks. Legal backlash, damaged credibility, not like it's not damaged anyways, and it sends a dangerous message outsourcing detention to authoritarian regimes. But you know what? At the end of the day, the human cost is even higher. Families, like that of Abrego Garcia, have been torn apart. Innocent people, like that Venezuelan stylist, now face indefinite detention under harsh conditions. SECOT's punitive approach may have reduced gang activity for now, but it does nothing to fix the deeper problems, like poverty, that really feed violence. So in the end, the cycle of violence may just continue, but now at the expense of justice and humanity.